He was in 8th grade, and his teacher was a bitch. The very first day of class, she told her new students that she doesn't like children. A curious admission from someone who works with kids. She was getting close to retirement, and it showed. She had a cruel and invasive manner that would make her classroom management style at home in a Pink Floyd video. She made a point to single out children to mock and belittle. She represented to Saul everything that he had grown to despise, that overbearing adult vindictiveness towards the next generation. An idea occurred to Saul as he read his new book on witchcraft. A simple spell, one like so many others, that required a degree of credulous on Saul's part. One that would only work if Saul put aside the technical hubris that dominated the 20th century. This was to be done old school. Saul had to concentrate on how much he hated his teacher to get this spell cast. It wasn't a difficult task. The spell itself took mere minutes and drew out of Saul every evil intention that he ever had. He believed, that this was a long shot. I mean, a simple spell associated with black string and emotions. Could this really work? As with all things, Saul would learn that his intent emotions were a spell in and of themselves. With the help of a class member, the last part of the spell, requiring the string to be attached to the victim. This was done with great poise by the boy Saul had called his apprentice. Saul fulfilled his bargain with the powers that be. It was time now to tell if the spell would work. This had hardly been done discreetly. Saul letting all of his classmates know that the time of their redemption was coming from the hands of their capricious lord of science. All they had to do now was wait. Saul would, of course, reap the benefits of the demise of their cruel master. She was not a young woman, and of course medical problems are hardly unusual at her age. Saul knew that anything he might be able to accomplish might appear as merely happenstance. He didn't care. If anyone, he reasoned, deserved to be permanently out of their lives, of these young children, this pseudoscientist did. Despite the grave consequences of his actions, if they actually worked, Saul found himself having fun with it all. For the first time in his life, Saul was in complete control. He was the master of another person's fate. He was powerful, dominant human being, and nothing was going to make him that scared little boy again. Then it happened. She became sick. It all happened so quickly. She became increasingly ill and was out of school for days. Then the days became weeks. Updates of her health was a daily reminder of her increased progression to that ultimate end. Saul's little spell was well known among the children, and perhaps even the administration. As she was progressively moved from one part of the hospital towards the more critical units, it seemed that Saul had gotten exactly what he wanted. But Saul is not a monster, despite what he wished he could be. With friends beginning to see the consequences of their own duplicity in his actions, they began to implore Saul to do something. Couldn't he erase the spell? Do something to bring their hated teacher back from the brink? The weight of his actions were dragging Saul down into a deep depression. He was a murderer. Their science teacher had gone from relatively good health to her deathbed. The whole process took less than a month. There was a way to break the spell. Unfortunately, Saul needed the string back, something that wouldn't happen. It's true that children can be dramatic, that perhaps she wasn't as bad as everyone said she was. Saul clung to this idea. He wasn't a Christian anymore, believing that he was a sole service of the adversary. Prayer, something that most people would have found themselves committing in earnest at this stage, was something he no longer considered. Parts of him was glad that the old crone would die. Parts of him knew that if she did die, her blood would be upon his hands. A real crisis for a boy of all his 14 years. It finally broke within him when the news was that she was not to be moved to another wing of the hospital. It was as real as it ever would be. She was literally at death's bed. Saul no longer felt powerful. He felt like a child who he knew would be held responsible for this murder, even if he never served time in prison. He hated himself. He hated what he had become. He still had one option, an option he dreaded and made him very sick to his core. His option, of course, was to beseech God to end this. He literally believed that God would have to take him instead. While still trying to justify himself, still trying to ignore his responsibility, he had a breakdown. In the bathroom, Saul fell to the floor, weeping for this hated teacher. His prayer was simple, one that came from the very essence of his being. Dear God, take me, not her. The most selfless act of Saul's short life had been accomplished. God heard his prayer. The teacher's health was restored almost as quickly as it had gone. She was soon back in school, a new woman. No one would accuse her of being a sweet, sensitive being, but then even a brush with death can't change everybody. She was no longer Saul's teacher, he having moved on. He didn't have any personal experience with her anymore, and only knew her from friends. That was, until one day, she cornered him in the hall. She didn't have much to say. She didn't need to say much. "Thank you," she said, as Saul stood in absolute awe. "Thank you, Saul." Gratitude that was undeserved and unasked for. It seemed that even the worst of us can learn, as Saul learned. Another page in Saul's life was now being turned, as Saul put away his childish things. His experience with a cult was, however, far from over.